Hello everybody, today I am driving one of the few old school Japanese cars you might still actually call good value for money. This is a 1993 Toyota Soarer, and it comes from very much the same school of thought as the BMW 8 Series. The idea really is to take all of the luxury elements of your top-flight saloon car, so for BMW it was the 7 Series, for Toyota the Lexus LS, but packaged in a more stylish, more appealing coupe form. With BMW, you got the 8 Series, and with Toyota and Lexus, you got the Soarer and the virtually identical Lexus SC. I've never really been much of a fan of either the Toyota or the Lexus version, the reason primarily being the looks. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the cars were actually styled by an American team, and I don't think there's really a good angle to it. The most awkward being the front, where it's not too bad, has a very long bonnet, but the headlight arrangement is just odd. I don't get it. At the rear, it's also that sort of terrible 90s softness. There is no edge to the car at all. It's all very, very weird. Looks like a car that was left out in the sun for a little bit too long. These are also relentlessly Japanese. I really, really mean that in every way, both good and bad. On the good side, this car is absolutely packed with technology, much of it quite useful, including stuff that would still make a spec sheet sound pretty good today. So we have, for example, air ride suspension with adjustable height and stiffness, independently controllable. I've currently got it in normal height and normal stiffness. You have speed-sensitive power steering, a beautiful three-dimensional digital dash that, granted, does now look a little bit out of date, but is still really quite impressive. It's actually fairly trippy to look at because all of the elements seem like they're at different levels. The indicators seem to just float in nothingness, really rather nice. You have fully electric memory seats with heating in too. You've even got, and I've never seen this on any other car, an ultrasonic cleaner for the wing mirrors. You press a button down here and they will apparently vibrate and shake themselves free of water. You have an amazing little cup holder here, which I'm told is functionally useless, but still a pretty piece of engineering. You've got climate control, and originally some of these cars were fitted with a system they called EMV, Electro Multivision, a touch-sensitive CRT display screen which you could control all of the car's functions through, and even included TV. That's not bad. Certain models were even sold with a brand spanking new CD-ROM based sat-nav as well. This is a serious features list, and if you went for the model above this, you even got four-wheel steer. Brilliant! Though I'm not fond of the looks. You can't accuse Toyota of being shy with the engineering. The car has double wishbone suspension, front and rear, and some of the largest doors you'll ever see, with a very clever hinge, a little bit like the Renault Avon time, that takes the door forwards and allows you to get out just that little bit easier. These seats have been sculpted in such a way as to give your passengers in the back just that little bit of extra legroom. There's even a clever system for getting the seat forward as a passenger in the back. There's a small little lever that can be operated with your foot. Touch that, the seat will tip forward and then move along electrically, allowing you to get out without having to clamber through and grab something, which can be a little bit awkward. There is, however, a bit of a flip side to all of this. This car came from an era where Lexus still didn't actually exist in Japan. There's a story about Lexus standing for luxury exports for the US market, although that sounds to me like one of those nice stories which isn't true. If somebody out there knows for a fact whether it is or isn't, please do tell me. I probably should just ask Lexus, shouldn't I? Might do that later. These days, the relationship between the two companies is fairly clear. Lexus is the posh one, Toyota the more accessible. But back then, it wasn't that way. In America, I think that's how it was meant to work, but because in Japan, Toyota was still the one and only brand, this meant that the Toyota versions of these cars could actually come with much better specification and trim levels than the Lexus equivalent, meaning that many people wanted instead the Toyota version. However, this is where things get really weird, the Japanese have always had a bit of an obsession with the foreign and the strange. That's not a uniquely Japanese thing. Look at the obsession we have with Japanese stuff. What this meant was that even in Japan, you wound up with a lot of Soarers actually being badged as their Lexus counterpart. Very strange. This car was one that suffered such a fate, although its owner has been doing his best to try and reverse that. I think it's particularly sad, as this is one of those cars where the Japanese went to the extent of actually giving it its own badging. So by default, you didn't really see many Toyota badges, if any, on this car at all. What you had instead was this weird little griffin thing that was the Soarer emblem. You see this on quite a few different Japanese cars from the time. They didn't have the Marks badge on, they instead had a model-specific one. I kind of like that. Makes things very, very hard to keep track of as an outsider, but it's cool nonetheless. Where things got further confusing with this, and a little disappointing, is in the choice of engines. The flagship available for this car was the 1JZ, the 2.5 litre turbocharged straight six. That's a very close relative of the 2JZ you'd find in the later Mark IV Supra, which is actually based on this car. The entry-level version of these cars actually did get a 2JZ engine, but a naturally aspirated one, making around 225 horses. The top-flight 1JZ made, as everything else did at the time, about 280 horsepower. Remember, this was when the Japanese gentleman's agreement was still in force, so everything made 280 horsepower. Then, as if things weren't already baffling enough, sandwiched in the middle, you had a V8. Not any old V8 though, this is Toyota and Lexus' fabled 1UZ, the unit that was at the heart of the LS400. It allegedly cost the company some $400 million to build and design this engine. Money well spent, because although the power figure may be rather modest, early cars like this had 250 horses, it was relentlessly reliable. These things really will do all the miles. Seriously. So that's the basic specification, and you would reasonably expect that this should be a brilliant car. It was, after all, built as a near cost-no-object exercise in showing the world just how good a car they could make by what was one of the world's biggest and best manufacturers. However, the truth is just a little bit more complicated. The expectations you'd have of something like this would be of either a luxurious or a sporty car, with the hope being that they'd find a nice compromise in the middle. The fact is, they didn't. You've probably noticed that this car isn't doing an exceedingly good job of coping with this very lumpy, bumpy, patched up Scottish tarmac I find myself on. It crashes into the road quite frequently, and the noise is transmitted to the cabin, and it creaks and rattles a little bit more than you might expect, and it isn't the pinnacle of luxury like a Lexus LS should and could be. You'll think, okay then, that's absolutely fine. What they're going for is a sportier vibe. Only, it doesn't really work that way either. You see, this car is fitted with a 4-speed automatic gearbox, the only option available for the V8. The 1JZ had a manual available, but surprisingly few people actually ever got it. These days you'll find a lot of converted cars where they've put a manual gearbox in, and I've driven one such equipped. In fact, if you want to make it into a sportier car, it's actually really very good at it. However, here, in virtually unmodified guise, it's not especially great in the bends. The steering is rather nice. When it does eventually weighten up, it's got reasonable feel to it, more weight than you might expect, and for a car that's close to 5 meters long, it's fairly agile. It helps that it's really quite narrow. At the time there was not quite controversy, but a little issue with the car in that it didn't fit within any of the Japanese government's tax brackets. In Japan they use the size of the car and some other metrics to determine how much road tax you'll pay, and this was too big for any of the smaller categories, meaning it was a very, very expensive car to purchase and run in its home market. The truth is, once you find a slightly better piece of tarmac like this one, it can actually be a quite enjoyable car to hustle. You're never going that quick though. The simple fact is, 250 horsepower and 1.6 tons is never going to produce earth-shattering acceleration. The 4-speed automatic gearbox only makes matters worse. I can't help but think with a manual in it, this would be an awful lot more entertaining. The gearbox is fairly dim-witted as well. I basically planted my foot there and it simply did not want to kick down. And then I put my foot halfway down rather than all the way, and it did. This car will soon be getting an exhaust, and that I think is a very, very sensible modification to make, because the engines, when uncorked, do sound good at the very least. And truth be told, this really is more of a motorway cruiser than a B-road blaster. I don't think this kind of road was ever where this car was supposed to shine. Yet, there is still quite a few good things to say about this car. The odd creak and rattle aside, nearly everything in here actually still works. The only reason the original EMV system was ever removed is because it was simply out of date. This car, like many I now suspect, has a basic Alpine double DIN unit here instead of the original system. It also has a pleasant surprise in the glove box, because somebody has put a miniature Nintendo SNES in it, preloaded with all sorts of games from yesteryear, which mean if you want, you can enjoy a quick round of Mario Kart or something with your friends. And although these are a darling of the JayEmm scene, for some strange reason in the last few years, they haven't seen prices skyrocket when nearly all others have. Everyone I talk to now about buying something like an S2000, a Supra, an RX-7, they all say, should have bought one of them a few years ago when I had the chance. They're nearly all silly money now, especially when it comes to stuff like the Skyline. But the best of the best Soarers, which for many people would be the manual-equipped 1JZ, commands only around £15,000. The least desirable, an automatic 2JZ, can be had for around 2 to 3, with this V8 being available at around 5 or 6. And that's a lot of money for a classic and, for some, very well loved Japanese luxury car. Even better than that, they don't actually seem to suffer all that much with many of the common Japanese car problems. Though they're not immune to rust, it doesn't seem to be as universally a problem as it is with many others. And this engine, the V8 specifically, has a reputation for being simply unburstable. If anything, the main thing to look out for with a Soarer is simply poor modification. People that have done silly things to the cars and essentially made them far worse. The air ride, I think, can really go in the bin, and for me, that would be a sensible thing to do, because at the moment, this car's biggest problem is that it does not know whether it wants to be sporty or luxurious, and rather than going one route or the other, has wound up treading this really very awkward path with the worst of both worlds. I think a well-judged coilover setup could make this into either a rather nice, luxurious thing to simply waft about in, or a more focused, more dedicated car. That would pair very well with a manual gearbox. And in all honesty, one of the best things about the Japanese car scene is doing that sort of stuff, is modifying the cars. That's all very much in the spirit of what Toyota intended. So as long as you're willing to see this, not really as a finished article, but simply a blank canvas, the starting point for your project, it could still make, actually, a pretty decent buy. Buy wisely, maybe spend that little bit extra and get a really good example, and you'll have a very nice car. Not only am I not a fan of the looks, but they, for some reason, nearly all seem to come in this same colour that's rather hard to describe, because it's definitely not black, it's not grey, it's not green, and it's not really blue either. I had to laugh because I opened up the centre console and found inside some touch-up paint, which will tell you that the colour of this car is in fact bluish green. It's actually a very accurate description. Anyway, that's a little look at a Japanese car that I've often failed to understand, but now think I do a little bit better. Don't forget to like, comment below, subscribe if you haven't already, and we'll see you all for the next one. Bye bye.